Hi, everyone. My name is Casey, and this is my Florida history project for Land Remembered. And today we are going to be talking about the time period of pioneer life in Florida. The characteristics of pioneer life really revolved around providing the basic necessities of life, including food, shelter, and clothing. These pioneers that came to Florida came on wagons with nothing, very little supplies. So they really had to start from the ground up, build their own home, and provide for their families with their hunting and gathering and farming. Families were really self-reliant on each other. They didn't have a neighborhood kind of community. So what their family produced is what they got to use and keep. And they were self-sufficient. So they were often forced to relocate from other states or different areas in Florida due to, catastrophic weather events, hurricanes, floods, or due to not the proper soil for the crops that they want to grow, or just inadequate food supply. So they'd often travel around the state, like we see in the text, The Land Remembered. Tobias and his family did have to relocate a couple times until they found a good spot for their home and future farmland. Family members really have specific duties during this time and responsibilities, whereas mostly the men, who is the father of the family, were tasked with clearing the land, building their home, plowing and planting crops for the family, and hunting for food. And the women mostly stayed at home, cooked all the meals, cleaned, kept up the house, made clothes and sewed items for the family, and took care of the children. And then once the children became of age, old enough to do chores around the house and the farm, children, then boys, males, would go out with their father and learn how to hunt or build things around the home. And women would stay home, help their mother cook and clean for the family. So this is a Florida history timeline and a brief little timeline of a couple important events during this period. The first thing we see is 1821 to 1845 territorial Florida, when Florida was just transferring from being a territory to becoming a state and ratifying into the United States. The pioneer era, which is what we are talking about mostly today, what is happened between the mid 1800s to the early 1900s. And during this time, the cattle and orange industry in Florida really exploded, which we will be discussing. And Tobias and his family were characters of that in A Land Remembered, so we know all that. The Civil War happened during this time. And then we see after the pioneer era came the Florida land boom and eventual bust. This is after World War I, where many people finally had time and money to come and visit Florida, or money to purchase homes for the first time. They traveled to Florida, purchased land, real estate, really cheap. And then once the paper money and credit ran out, all of that industry eventually, the market crashed and the industry busted. And then in 1939 to 1945 was World War II, and Florida's important role that they played in that. They helped prepare soldiers for this war. They patrolled the coastline all over the state of Florida, and they helped keep an eye out for enemy aircraft. But today we are focusing just on the pioneer life of Florida, which is really what A Land Remembered encompasses, early pioneer life with Tobias and his family first moving here from Georgia. What he really got into to help push his family to become what they were later at the end of the story was the cattle industry, which really exploded in Florida during that time. So from chapter 16, we see a quote that says, "At the end of the street, a dock ran 100 feet out into the bay, and adjacent to the dock, there was a cattle chute. A small shack on pilings was at the left of the dock, and at the end, a side wheel steamer belched smoke from its two stacks." So the picture on the right here is actually a primary source picture. This is from 1890 in Punta Rasa, which is where Tobias and his family brought their first cattle herd, and many cattle herds after, to collect all of their gold doubloons. So this is, I think, a great example of what we read about in the text. It shows the wharf and the bay where cattle were pushed along this long chute, with this boat being out far past the dock, just like is mentioned in the text. We see a small shack on pilings that was mentioned at the text, And then here our big steamer boat with its smokestack, and which is what cattle were hurried and rushed into and loaded, which many ships could carry at least 200 head of cattle per trip. Another big example or big characteristic of pioneer life during that time, which we see in the text, was the citrus industry. So once Tobias and his family succeeded in cattle, Tobias was obsessed with growing oranges, which we see was transferred on to later family generations with Zech and Saul. So this is a picture of a family at an orange grove in Hawthorne, Florida, which I thought may have looked really similar to what Tobias was trying to grow and what Saul was able to grow later. And the citrus industry really exploded with the help of railroads. When railroads came to the state, all of these acres were left by the railroad to grow oranges, and these oranges were later then shipped on the trains for places all over the state and all over the country. And it was originally thought that Florida had the perfect climate and soil to grow oranges. We had a very temperate weather with nice soil that would be easy for farmers to grow Florida oranges and citrus and then export them. They thought it would require very little effort. And that was the case until we had the Great Freeze in 1895. And that Great Freeze was mentioned in our text. We see here, it's an excerpt from chapter 32 of A Land Remembered that says, the next morning, the snow still came, not a blinding blizzard as the day before, but a steady falling of white flakes. At noon, it stopped and was replaced by sleet once more, frozen rain that formed a hard crust over the 7 inches of powdery snow. The thermometer rose only 1 degree to 12 and hovered there. And then a little later, after the freeze, the after effects of the freeze, Zech goes out to try to see what's going on. And we have another little passage here that says, news drifted in from the north and south. And Zech learned that orange groves were almost totally destroyed everywhere. Not one tree was alive north of Lake George, and trails leading north out of the state were filled with steady streams of families leaving the land and heading into Georgia or Alabama or the Carolinas or wherever else they could go and start a new life. So here on the right, we see another primary source, which was family letters from the Austin family, who were another pioneer family during this time in the 1800s. And you see here down towards the end of the letter, it's Austin family is writing to Mr. Wilsey. And this is after the fact in 1900, but they are recalling events from 1895, which says, we got along very well until a great freeze struck us in 1895, when we had our trees all killed to the ground and lost our entire crop of 4,000 boxes of oranges, which were on the trees. And from that time to this, we have been trying to rebuild our groves, but have had them frozen down nearly every year since. So during that time in pioneer life, they really relied on the land and their oranges and their citrus and other crops to make their money. So when that went bad, a lot of families had to leave the state or really rebuild and try to find that next source of income for their family. So here we see just a kind of brief little overline of Florida pioneers throughout history. Started with the first pioneers coming to Florida. The settlers were attracted to Florida's climate, which was believed to be perfect for farming, which it was for quite some time. They arrived with very little and had to grow their own crops, raise their own cattle, and hunt for their own food. And we see that throughout the story of A Land Remembered. And then the cattle trade exploded here, where pioneers made a fortune selling cattle to both the armies on both sides of the Seminole, Civil, and Spanish-American Wars. They became actually for a while the nation's leading cattle exporter. And then this really helped contribute to Florida's economic recovery during the Reconstruction era Depression. And then after the cattle trade really exploded, we see a lot of families, and Tobias and his family included in A Land Remembered, go on to the citrus industry, which is still occurring in Florida today. It's many pioneers transitioned from herding cattle to growing oranges. After the arrival of the railroad, they used that existing farmland and kind of switched from cattle to crops. The railroad helped revolutionize their way of life by allowing pioneers to ship oranges and their exports all over the country. And those orange fields and orange groves are still prevalent, maybe not so much in Florida today as they were, but Florida is still known for their exports of citrus and oranges. So for our activity today, we are going to do load up your wagon, which is something that many Florida pioneer families had to travel on, and that was their one source of belongings. Everything that could fit in their wagon is what they brought. So the standard which we would be exploring today would be social studies. It's a level grade 4 of describing pioneer life in Florida, which examples can include the role of men, women, children, Florida Crackers, and Black Seminoles. So today with this activity, we would really be focusing on the pioneer life and characteristics of men, women, and children during this time frame, which is a really fun activity. We're going to make our own little covered wagon and see if our belongings that we would need for our daily activities would fit in it. If not, we will have to make some choices about what might get left behind, because everything that Florida pioneers had to have with them, they had to travel with, would have to fit in their wagon. So for this activity, we just need 3 sheets of paper, a ruler, markers or crayons, a stick glue or tape. I think stick glue is easier, and a pair of scissors. So we're going to start our activity today by cutting 2 sheets of paper into 8.5-inch squares. So I have my 2 sheets of paper and I have my ruler. I'm just going to measure down the side 8.5 inches. I'm going to make a little mark and then I'm going to cut across to form my 2 8.5-inch squares. All right, so I made my line across on my 2 pieces of paper for my 8.5-inch square. So I'm just going to cut across that line. All right, now I have my 2 pieces of paper, 8.5-inch squares. I'm going to color 1 square brown, and that will become the inside of our wagon for when we do our wagon activity. And I have one that I had just pre-colored just to save us some time. So I have one piece of brown square and then 1 white square. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to cut the top corners of both of my squares to round them. This will just help give us the rounded look of a covered wagon. So I'm going to take my scissors and my 2 8.5-inch squares and just cut the top of the corner so it is rounded. I'm going to do that on both sides. Now I have my 2 rounded edges, and I'm going to take the white piece of paper, fold it in half like a hot dog. And I'm going to cut along this line here. So it's going to give me 2 pieces of white paper. I have my 2 pieces of white flaps that I cut down in the middle. So now that I have my 2 sides, these are going to be the sides of our wagon. I'm going to glue the white pieces to the brown square along the outside edges. So what I do is I just kind of fold it down a little bit just to make a flap. So I folded down the edge of my white paper, just a little lip so I can glue that to the bottom of the brown paper. And I'm going to do that on both sides of my white paper. I have little edges on the bottom. And I'm going to glue that to the bottom side of my brown paper on each side. So I'll do that pretty quickly. I just took my glue stick and rubbed it straight down the edge, all the way down of the edge that I folded. And then I'm going to take my brown piece of paper and I'm going to line up the edges. Just going to fold this a little bit to help the glue stick. So I have one side, that's going to be the bottom of my covered wagon, and this is going to be the side. And I'm going to do that now on the other side. Once again, I'm just taking my glue stick and going straight down the edge that I folded, just so I can have that little lip of paper. And I'm going to stick that on the edge of my brown paper on the bottom, and then kind of fold it over so it stays good and glued. All right, so now I have my mini covered wagon, and you can see here, if you take the edges and fold them up, this is what your wagon will look like. You have the edges here that are rounded in the front. Looks like a wagon with our brown bottom. So once we have that done, you can see our wagon. You're going to fold open the edges, see your brown bottom. And then on the third sheet of paper that was blank, now you're going to draw all the supplies that you could think of that you think a Florida Pioneer would need to take with them. So we need to plan for every member of the family. What supplies does the father need, the mother, and children to carry out their daily tasks of working and building a home, providing food, weapons that they may need to kill animals or hurt intruders that come to them. So we need to think about those things, and we're going to draw those out on our third piece of paper. And just to save time, I did draw a bunch already. I have a toy chest that kids would use. I planned for a little girl's clothes, mom's clothes, a trunk of food, and just some kitchenware, basic plates, cups, cutlery, pots and pans that they would use to cook on. And then we have a lasso, because just like Tobias and his family, they herded cattle and used those for their cows and their horses. Then we have clothes for male members of the family, jeans, shirts for a father and a son. And then we have a chest of tools and a chest of weapons. And these are all things that Florida Pioneers would need to use every day of their life. So these are things that can't get left behind. So you're going to take that, write out your supplies, draw those out on your third piece of paper. And then once you have everything that you think Florida Pioneers might need on a daily basis, you're going to cut those out. And then once everything is cut out, those are the items that are going to need to be glued down into the bottom of your covered wagon. We have to have everything needs to fit. So these are things that they would use every day that they cannot go without. These are necessities. So I'm going to put my food in here. That is something they will definitely need. Some kitchen supplies, pots and pans to cook with over a fire. They will definitely need. They will have to have their weapons and toolboxes. These could be tools for their animals, tools that they may use for farming. Those are all parts of the daily life of Florida Pioneers. So I'm going to glue those down. And when I drew these clothes, I had envisioned like this being equivalent to a stack of clothes. So each like shirt or dress that you may see would be a stack of clothes for that family member. All right. And our wagon is getting full, so we may need to make some choices of what may be brought and what might be left behind. And this is just what Florida Pioneers would have to do back in the 1800s and 1900s. Okay, so I'm almost finished. So see here, we have everything glued down in our covered wagon. We have our tools, our kitchen supplies, cooking supplies, food, weapons, our lasso that is needed for the animals, clothes for mom, dad, boy, and girl. Now, these are all the necessities that a Florida Pioneer family would have to have. So I still have one more thing, which is a toy chest, which might be really important and might mean a lot to the kids of the family. But as you can see in our covered wagon, there is no more room. So this toy chest is something that they would have to make those tough decisions of what to bring and what items might get left behind. Since there is no more room for the toys would get left behind, because in pioneer times, you have to bring the necessities first in order to survive, to order to build your house, provide food for your family and clothing for your family. All right, and then on this last slide here, we just see our my references that I used for this project, which concludes my Florida History project for the day on Pioneer Life. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you.